Hello, fellow nerds, and welcome to another episode of the Nerdy Nike. And today we will be talking about one of the most controversial comics made in American history, Zap Comics number 4, and how the Supreme Court ultimately led to the decline of the underground comics market. Excuse me. Now, Zap Comics is the first underground comics, even though Evo and underground newspapers showed underground comic strips beforehand. Zap Comics is deemed the first underground comic. Zap number 1 to be exact. Now, our controversy doesn't come until 4 issues later because Zap number 1, 2, and I believe 3 were in right order. And then their 4th issue was Zap number 0, which was done before Zap number 1, but it wasn't produced until after Zap Comics number 3. So that means Zap Comics number 4 is the 5th issue made in Zap Comics. I know, especially if you're a 90s DC fan, they have the zeros, but they actually came out before the ones. This one was different. But anyways, back to the track of underground comics with Zap Comics number 4. It had a court case called the People of New York versus Kirkpatrick. Ultimately, 4 comic book clerks were arrested, and 2 of them faced charges that went straight up to a court case, since the New York People of New York versus Kirkpatrick, because the comic book Zap Comics number 4 they sold was deemed obscene. And in that time, in late 60s, early 70s, it was highly inappropriate, I should say, to be selling obscene comics. And when I say obscene, that means like not really violence, but outrageous gore, sets, drug use, and stuff like that would be considered obscene, which underground comics heavily did, because underground comics were like indie comics we have nowadays, but instead of just, producing comics without the heavy big power of DC and Marvel behind them, it was more to spite the Comic Code Authority, which was a censorship made on comics in the 50s, and they were pretty prominent all the way up until the 80s and 90s, when they sort of died off, and the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund bought them off to use them for money gathering resources. And if you want to support them, it goes to the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. So if you want to have the comic code on your comic, it goes to a good cause. But anyways, let's get back into it. I'll talk about the story that was deemed obscene to sell. And it was a outlook on the nuclear family, a satire if you would, where a Disney executive would be working, a white collar job. He would go back home to his stay-at-home wife and his children, a daughter and a son, and perform extracurricular family activities. I'll just say this and move on. Their motto is a play on a family that plays together, stays together, but remove the P. Now, let's get on with it. Because the 2 people who were arrested and faced charges were Peter Dargis and Peter Kirkpatrick. The judge that was overviewing the case was Joel Tyler. He has done stuff with obscenity before, deeming a movie too obscene and raising its popularity, which didn't really happen. Well, sort of happened in this case, but it really didn't happen. So, the defenses for Zap Comics number 4, specifically helping Kirkpatrick and Dargis from being sued, they brought up a Golden Age artist, Gil Kane, as their first defense. And he is an artist who helped create Alan Scott's Green Arrow. He has worked with Golden Age DC, Atlas Comics, and Flash Gordon, the savior of the universe. Da, da, da. Alright, but anyways, and then he compared R Crumb's works to that of an expressionistic painter, because even though the work itself is shocking, there is a lot of context. And let's have a word about R Crumb's work, because most of the time it is perceived as racist, misogynistic, and generally tasteless for today's time and even back then in the 60s and 70s. But I compare him to Tyler, the creator at the time, because he was trying to fight out against the system. He was also heavily influenced by psychedelics and LSD at the time. And not to try to justify it, because I actually agree with what Trina Robbins says, because she doesn't really understand why people like R. Crumb's work, because how can things like rape and murder be funny? And while I agree with that sentiment, there are some things like the story that's mentioned in the family that lays together is a look on the nuclear family, which was at the time perceived as a great outlook. Nothing wrong with it, but it shows that behind closed doors things are not what it seems, and so forth and so on. And one of the arguments being made was that. And to follow up with that, they introduced two more people. One of them was a curator at the New York's Whitney Museum of American Art, who even showed R. Crumb's works in an art piece called the Human Concern and Personal Treatment, the Grotesque in the American Art. And that curator was Robert M. Doty, if you want to look him up. I don't know if you can. But the second person was a professor of Columbia University, a humanities professor, Stephen Marks, and he would show Crumb's work in his class to provoke discussion in his students over morals and what they perceived in the images. But that's not really going to help out unless they really bring up something to shock the comic book industry. And their last defense was honestly that he revealed a lot of stuff to Joel Tyler, being that it was Sidney Jacobson, an editor at Harvey Publications. They did like Casper, Ghost, Wendy, and so forth. But he also worked with Archie Comics, Archie, Riverdale, Jughead, Betty, and Veronica. And the conversation that he and Judge Tyler had essentially proved that children's comics like Archie and stuff like that were sexualizing their teenage characters to promote sales in their teenage market. And both Jacobson and Judge Tyler could agree to that fact that they were sexualizing underage characters to promote sales. But everything I previously mentioned did not help their defense case, because it was still deemed that they sold obscene material to an underground cop, and they were charged $500 and for 90 days in jail, which they tried to appeal multiple times. I want to say they appealed 5 times, but I could be wrong. And it ultimately got all the way up to the Supreme Court, where the case was dismissed. And this was a huge blow to the underground market, except for some publishers who were able to make ties and stuff and still be able to sell it in places like head shops, which is not what you think. It's tobacco shops. And then XXX, adult stores. But you gotta make your sales somehow, right? But years after the case, Judge Tyler has stated that he wished he did it differently, considering how things have changed, and works like that would have been more appropriate to sell at today's time. Hard to believe, right? But this case is also one of the biggest inspirations behind the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which is a legal fund built to defend the freedom of speech and creative rights for the creators behind comic books and the actual sales behind comics as well. And maybe things would have been different if it was built back then, but the world may never know. So that's about it, folks. If you enjoyed the video or learned something you didn't know before, please select a like, subscribe if you want, and if not, keep nerding out, and I hope you have a good one.